A few years ago, I was in the officers' mess at the Governor General's Foot Guards at Cartier Square here in Ottawa. And on the wall, I saw a painting of a young man, a young officer in the Canadian Army. And his name was O'Kill Massey Learmonth. Interesting name. He was a major in the Canadian Armed Forces in World War I, and he's one of Canada's 81 Victoria Cross winners. I wanted to learn more about the history of this extraordinary young man who sadly died at the young age of 23 in service to his country. I want to do a bit of a background into the Victoria Cross. The Victoria Cross is the highest honor for valor in the entire British Empire. These are not just ordinary medals that you get for long service in the Canadian Forces or for any ordinary acts of bravery which are expected of our men and women in uniform. These are truly inspiring and exemplary acts of valor and greatness in the presence of the enemy. Victoria Cross was created by Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert to recognize the exemplary acts of bravery by British soldiers who fought in the Crimean War. Prior to the Victoria Cross being created, the only recognitions for valor in the British forces at the time were giving people these fancy orders like the Order of the Bath and other things that were usually reserved for the officer class or people that gave long service in the British Army. Now, after the Crimean War, Queen Victoria and her husband Prince Albert wanted to find a way to recognize the exemplary bravery of just the ordinary soldiers, regardless of the circumstances of their birth or their class in British society. This was a really forward-thinking policy at the time because at the time, society was very elitist. It was controlled by aristocrats, and recognizing just ordinary soldiers for acts of bravery was something that was pretty novel at the time.
Amid London's bomb-damaged buildings stands an unpretentious little workshop where that most famous of medals, the VC, is made.
Now, unlike other medals that were in circulation at the time, the Victoria Cross wasn't designed to be fancy. It wasn't made out of gold or silver. It wasn't extraordinarily large. It was actually made out of very simple and basic metals that were melted down from captured Russian cannons from the Crimean War. Now, this is so much more than just any medal. This is a medal for exemplary bravery, and only 81 Canadians have ever been awarded the Victoria Cross for their actions in the war in South Africa, the First World War, and the Second World War. The medal that's in them themselves is considered worthless, but because of the meaning behind these medals and the bravery and the stories behind it, individual medals are worth up to 400,000 British pounds. That's equal to almost 700,000 Canadian dollars per medal. Now, there were 81 Canadians who have received the Victoria Cross over 3 of Canada's wars, and reading the stories of these extraordinary Canadians and their feats of valor is just truly awe-inspiring. Now, jumping back to the story of O'Kill Massey Learmonth. Major Learmonth was an important Canadian. He was a member of a regiment that has now become known as the Governor General Foot Guards, a regiment that I served in. Major Learmonth was from Quebec City. He was a young man who joined the Canadian Forces, the Canadian Expeditionary Force as it was called at the time, when they went over to France to defend the liberty of France against German aggression. Imagine yourself in the trenches of France. The year is 1917. You're near a city called Luz on the Belgian border. This terrain has been fought over. These trenches have been captured and recaptured and fought over for 3 years. You can't even recognize the terrain from what it was just 3 short years before the war started. All you can see is mud for miles on end, barbed wire, trenches, artillery craters, and dying foes and friends alike. Both sides used toxic artillery shells, shooting mustard gas into their enemies' defenses. This gas destroyed the lungs of the victims. This was truly horrific fighting, and the Canadians have been tasked with taking Hill 70 to form a distraction to draw German forces away. Major Learmonth and his company are launching the attack, and they're initially successful, but then the Germans counterattack. Major Learmonth and his company are temporarily surprised, but instead of retreating, Major Learmonth charges straight at the enemy under an intense artillery barrage where an estimated 20,000 mustard gas shells were launched in 2 days alone. Major Learmonth is mortally wounded, but choosing not to go back to receive medical care at the rear, he continues to lead his men on, standing on the parapet, dispatching German counterattackers, literally catching enemy grenades and throwing them back at the enemy. Despite his wounds and unable to fight near the end, he continued to stay at the front, issuing orders to his junior officers to continue on the fight, and they were successful. The German counterattack failed. Hill 70, a critical observation post on the front lines, was held. And finally, when Major Learmonth could fight no longer, when he could issue orders no longer, he went to the rear. And sadly, this 23-year-old Canadian died the next day. Now, because of the sacrifices of Major Learmonth and so many like him, the Allies held Hill 70 that day, a critical stepping stone to defeating the German Empire. Now, in the diaries of German Crown Prince Ruprecht, who was commanding German forces at that time, referred to the Canadians, these were the best English troops. This is just one story of a Canadian hero who won the Victoria Cross. This was just one story among many of young Canadians who left our wonderful great home here in Canada to fight in a foreign land for the values that we Canadians hold dear. Major Learmonth was inducted into the Historical and Literary Society of Quebec at the age of 20. He had a bright future, and then he died at the age of 23 in sacrifice for his country. Now, you may think, I could never win a Victoria Cross. These people must have had extraordinary abilities and extraordinary talents. But looking at the story of Major Learmonth and so many like him, these were just ordinary men. These were volunteers who didn't even have military backgrounds or training before they fought. They were very quickly trained and they were sent to the Western Front. And it's precisely because they were ordinary people that Queen Victoria created the Victoria Cross. Because ordinary people put in extraordinary situations can show exemplary valor and bravery, even in the presence of an enemy force. We remember the sacrifices of those like Major Learmonth and all of the Canadians who didn't come home, and the Canadians who did come home, but with battle scars, both physical, mental, and spiritual, lest we forget.